I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest is Rusty Paul, former Georgia State Senator, former chair of the Georgia Republican Party, former member of the Stone Mountain City Council, and a former member of the Bush administration. Rusty, that's a mouthful.
It is, and now I'm a former member of the Sandy Springs City Council, so I've done.
Oh, I missed that. Yes, yes.
I served one term and just finished up last year. So,
right. The new city.
The brand new city. Yeah. I was part of the inaugural.
Tell us about that. How do you transition from a sort of a not rural but suburban area into a city?
Well, it took 35 years to do it. I mean, it was a long time coming, and a wonderful lady who's the mayor there now, Eva Galambos, was kind of the person who started that effort in the 1970s. And for a variety of political reasons, it took a long time, mostly because Sandy Springs was perceived to be kind of the heart of the Republican power center in Metro Atlanta. It was called, the nickname of it for years was the Golden Ghetto, and then of course the legislature being dominated by Democrats, they really weren't fired up about creating a new city, a new political entity that would be dominated by Republicans. So for that and a variety of other reasons, it took 35 years and really only came after the Republicans took control. And then we had our first election in 2005, and the city's been unbelievably successful, and that's a story of Georgia politics unto itself that you ought to explore in one of these as well.
Right. Well, Rusty, with your permission, we'd like to talk to you about your early life,
okay,
your years as a public servant, and finally your life after politics. Okay. So let's get underway by finding out about Rusty Paul.
Well, I grew up in a very politicized environment. None of my family had ever run for office, and they were, when I first ran for office when I was still just a young kid, my dad was appalled that I would get involved in politics. But I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, in that area in the late 1950s and 1960s. And I don't have to tell you what a political cauldron that really was. And politics was all around. It's what everybody talked about. I mean, you would sit, it was rural Alabama, you'd sit on my grandparents' porch, my parents and uncles and cousins, and everybody would sit there and they were talking about what was going on in Birmingham and the rest of the South, the changes that were going on. And obviously, being conservative Southern, white Southerners, they weren't real thrilled with a lot of the changes, but that was the conversation, and I don't know what it was about me that was drawn to it. My grandmother lived about a quarter mile away, and every day when I got old enough, I walked to her house for two things. One, she took the Birmingham Post-Herald, and they delivered it by post office. The mailman brought it, and then she always saved a couple of biscuits for her oldest grandson, and I'd have a couple of biscuits and honey, and then read the Birmingham Post-Herald, and it was all about politics. It was the heyday of George Wallace, and so I grew up with surrounded by not so much political people, but people talking about politics. And I'll never forget when Governor Wallace was running over there, he couldn't run for re-election. I worked for a little radio station in my hometown of Aniana, Alabama, and the owner of the radio station was one of 7 state senators who filibustered the bill that prevented George Wallace from succeeding himself. So Lurleen Wallace was running, and in fact, Senator Bentley, and none of those 7 people were ever elected to any office in the state of Alabama after that again. But as a kid, growing up on a farm, I had 2 hours of freedom in town every Saturday. My mom had a 2-hour hair appointment, and I went with her, and I got to roam the streets of a small southern town, doing the things that little boy's not supposed to, go in the pool hall and stuff like that, But one Saturday, I heard music, a country band, I think bluegrass music, coming from the courthouse. And I walked up, and there was a flatbed truck parked in front of the courthouse, and there was a band. And all the farmers and their wives were in town. And so after about 10 minutes or so listening to the music, excuse me, a big black Ford or Mercury drives up, and out jumps George C. Wallace. He jumps up on the flatbed truck and launches into one of his patented speeches, and I'm sitting there watching. I'm probably about 13, 14 years old. And in the middle of the speech, he just kind of reached over and he got to that part where, you know, I'm going to talk about what we've done for Blount County, Alabama. He reached over and an aide handed him a piece of paper. He literally read it off and then handed it back. Never missed a beat, went right into his speech. And it was, to me, I was offended by it. I said, you know, this guy has no clue what he's done for my county. If they hadn't given him that sheet of paper, he would never have known. And I grew up, and while my grandfather was a big Jim Folsom fan, and Big Jim kind of collapsed in that campaign, and it really came down to George Wallace and Ryan DeGraff and Reed. And I was a big Ryan DeGraff and Reed fan in that 1962 race in the 3rd grade. And so, you know, I was not a Wallace guy to begin with, and that just kind of offended me for some reason or other. I don't know why, but so I grew up in that environment. And my dad, every Sunday night, after church, we drove to Birmingham, which is about 30 minutes. My dad worked for a magazine here in Atlanta, and they shipped the magazines by bus, and he picked them up on Sunday at the Birmingham bus station, which where John Lewis and the Freedom Riders were beaten. And I knew that the police station was literally across the street. My dad was a photographer for the magazine, and there was a small photographic shop on the west side of Birmingham that he dropped his film off at the end of every week. And then while he was traveling, one of my jobs was to go by and pick up that film, and it was operated by a gentleman and his wife named Chris Doss. Chris's daughter, Alice, was my age, and she was one of the 4 girls killed in the 16th Street church bombing. So that world was not abstract to me. It was real. I knew the people. I knew the places. I knew the Birmingham civil rights area was a very compact. It's just a very small area, just a few blocks from the 16th Street Church, where they started the marches through the Kelly Ingram Park to the City Hall to the bus station. All that stuff is literally 2 or 3 square blocks, where all this history has occurred. So I grew up in that environment. And so at a very early age was surrounded by politics and the impact of politics. And I watched my hometown of Birmingham. I came to understand very early on the importance of political leadership, particularly when I came to Atlanta right after that, when I graduated from college. Birmingham had been the same size as Atlanta. In fact, it was called the Magic City. It was the one place on earth where you had coal, limestone, and iron ore, the 3 elements needed to make steel. It was all right there in one location, and Birmingham was growing unbelievably. It was founded in the 1870s and was the fastest growing city in the South. And then George Wallace and Bull Connor came in with their political leadership in a negative sense and totally stymied the growth of that city, ruined its reputation nationally. And then watching Atlanta, which is 150 miles away, same kind of city, same town, different political leadership, Ivan Allen, Carl Sanders, and having the right kind of political leadership made all the difference in the world in the communities. And so as a result of all that, at a very, very young age, I don't know why I was able to absorb and process that kind of information, I became politicized myself and realized that if I wanted to do something politically or do something significant in my home area of the South, Alabama and Georgia, then politics was the way to do it. And I realized that one of the problems of the South was the absence of a competitive political environment. You had the primaries and that was it. And I believe that the South was somewhat politically retarded because of the absence of a strong 2-party system. So being basically conservative, believing that we needed to develop a 2-party system, when I came to Atlanta, I began to get involved politically and looking for a campaign. I attended church, and I rented an apartment when I came to Atlanta. My wife and I, we'd married right out of college, and we rented an apartment in Avondale, and I was going to church there. And I went out on Sunday morning and looked at a bumper sticker, and there was a guy who was a member of our church, who was running for the DeKalb County Commission. And I asked one of the church members that I knew, I said, "Who is this guy?" And he told me he was, a local insurance guy running for the county commission. I said, "Is he Republican or Democrat?" He said, "Well, I'm not sure. I think he's a Republican." I said, "Well, ask him to call me." And nothing happened that week, and I saw him again at church the next week and said, "Your guy never called me." He said, "Oh, I didn't call him." In about an hour after I got home from church, a guy by the name of Jim Kelly, who became one of my early mentors, called me and said, "Hey, we're going to have a campaign meeting this afternoon for Jim Armstrong. I understand you want to help. Why don't you come?" And that was my very first involvement in active politics. I got involved in that local political campaign. Because my background was journalism, I could write, and so I did press releases, and I started learning politics from the grassroots up at local elections, how to manage the local races, and got involved in the local in the Republican Party of DeKalb County, and just kind of began to work my way up. And that was 1976, and I actually, by then, I'd bought my first house in Stone Mountain. It was in the city limits, and I got to checking, and sure enough, we had a city election in November, well, actually early December of 1977. So I thought, I think I'll run for city council, but I knew enough that I couldn't just show up and run, and so I'd start going to city council meetings and got to understand what was going on and ran. To my surprise and everybody else's, I won. I beat one of the only football heroes the city of Stone Mountain ever had, a guy by the name of Phil Ash, who was Fran Tarkington Center at the University of Georgia and been grown up in Stone Mountain. And I learned a very valuable lesson. My daughter, who's now in her 30s, was 11 months old, and I put her on I literally hand printed my brochures because we had no money, and put her picture on the front and said, "Why Rusty Paul wants to be your city councilman," and talked about creating a city that she could grow up in. And then 2 years later, I put my picture on it. I won in a landslide the first time. When I put my picture on, I won 5 by 5 votes. So I learned a very valuable lesson early on. You know, that's why politicians kiss babies. That's kind of how I got involved in politics. It's a long-winded story, but that's the path that got me started.
Well, what happened next?
I ran and was elected to the city council in Stone Mountain and served 4 two-year terms. Fortunately, it was a nonpartisan election, so nobody knew about my political affiliation. I don't think if they'd known I was Republican, there'd been absolutely no way I would have won. But I'll never forget, right after the election, we were at a little banquet around town. I was a couple of seats down from the mayor, and somebody leaned over to him and said, "Hey, do you know you just elected a Republican to your city council?" I thought he was going to choke on his steak, and he leaned over at me and said, "Is that true?" I said, "Yes, Mayor, it is." And he thought about it for a while, and then he didn't say anything else. And his name was Randolph Medlock. He was one of the longest serving mayors in the state of Georgia and was really an important mentor to me. He taught me how to govern. You know, he put me in tough situations so I would learn. He also kept me from making bad mistakes. When the night of my election, you could go in, they had 3 ladies who counted all the votes. And so I was going to go in and watch them count the votes. It's an open process. And he literally, he was a little bit short guy, and I'm a pretty big guy, so he leaned over, grabbed me by the collar and said, "Where are you going?" So I'm going to go in there and watch the votes. He said, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." And I kind of looked at him, and there was just something about his voice. I knew that he was giving me good advice, and I had no idea why. So I stayed out, and sure enough, they came out and announced the winners of the election in about an hour after they hand counted the ballots. And afterwards, a month or so after I got to know him a little bit better, "Why did you do that?" He said, "Those ladies have been counting those ballots in this city for generations, for decades." Said, "If you had gone in there, they would have felt that you didn't trust them. And you might have won this election, but you would have never won another one." And so, you know, it was just stuff like that. He was always giving me good advice, putting me in position to learn. It's like I tell my kids, my job is to make sure you learn to use your wings without breaking them. He took a very young guy, 24 years old, and these were all World War II veterans who'd come back from World War II, gotten elected. He'd been mayor since I was 2 years old, so he'd been around for a long time. And he really took me under his wing, taught me about governing, about working with people, about the processes. And it was invaluable, absolutely invaluable. That's one of the reasons why I ran for the city council in Sandy Springs. It was my way. We had a brand new group of elected officials who'd never served before. And I was able to pay Randolph Medlock back by going in and doing the same thing for them that he and those other older members of the Stone Mountain Council had done for me. So that's how I, and I served 4 terms. Everybody thought I'd run for mayor when he retired. I didn't. I had a friend of mine came to me and said, I really want to be mayor. And I said, well, I'll support you. She ran, Jane Rhodes, and became the mayor, and I went on and did other stuff. The guy that I'd worked in his campaign, Jim Armstrong, was an insurance agent. He lost. It was 1976 was Jimmy Carter year in Georgia's bad time to be running for anything as a Republican. So we lost pretty badly. But he was active in the Reagan campaign, and they were looking for a local kind of a press person in this part of the South, and he recommended me, and so I started to work in the Reagan campaign of 1980 as kind of a press aide, and did that for about a year and a half, and in the process of that met an old NFL quarterback by the name of Jack Kemp. And Jack became a close mentor to me, and ultimately I went to HUD. I managed his campaign when he ran for president, and we got to know each other during that process. So, a lot of the relationships and so on that propelled me along the way came from that 3 or 4 years of just being a young kid, willing to work hard. Willing to learn, willing to kind of listen to their seniors a little bit, and then having some really good mentors, I was able to kind of move through, and there was a lot less competition in the Republican Party in those days, so you could kind of move up through the ranks real quickly, and so I took advantage of that and was able to take on some positions of responsibility that probably today a younger person would have maybe years of effort to get to do some of the things that I got to do at a very early age.
Let's talk for a minute about the ins and outs of a national presidential campaign.
It's one of the most fascinating things in the world. You really get to see how diverse a country this really is. When you're dealing in Georgia politics, Georgia's a very diverse state. We talked about having 2 Georgias. We really got 3. We got the coast, we got the rest of the rural area, and then we got the metro Atlanta area. The politics of Iowa, New Hampshire, New York, California is a lot different than the politics here, and you have to be able to structure your campaigns differently. You've got to be able to manage your message so that it becomes a national message, but you really kind of have 50 different campaigns with a lot of different pressures, a lot of different traditions, a lot of different rules. And so it's fascinating to watch. And I've been fortunate. I've worked in the Reagan campaign of '80. I ran Jack Kemp's presidential campaign in Georgia in '88. Got to do work at the national conventions. Then worked for Steve Forbes in both his presidential campaigns, and did a little bit of work for Giuliani in the last one. And it's unlike any other thing in politics because you're under a microscope constantly. Everything you think, say, and do is analyzed, and yet it's a very lonely existence. You can, you're a big, if you're a senator from New York or California or a governor of Georgia, when you go to Iowa and New Hampshire, they don't know and they don't care. That you're a big wig in your local area. They just really, they have their own set of things that they're looking for. And you have to, it's a very lonely existence. You go out, you used to, if you're the governor of Georgia, which Jimmy Carter was, you go hold a speech, you're gonna have a room full of people. When you go to Iowa to hold a speech, you're lucky if you got 10 people sometimes in somebody's living room. And so it's a lot of retail politics. It's just murder on a political figure's ego because they're having to answer questions and be poked and prodded and dealt with in ways that they're not. And so a lot of ways, it's a very humiliating process for the candidates when you sit back and watch what they go through and so on. But it's fascinating because no other country chooses its leadership the way we do. And so you really go through a crucible when you're involved in a national campaign. The pressures, the scrutiny, all of that is just so intense. You know, you're having to go talk to over a kitchen table with some lady who's important in some small county in New Hampshire or Iowa. She's important in about a 5 square mile area, but in the big picture, you know, she's not that important. But in that race, in this area, in this caucus, in this primary, that lady's important, and you better, you know, you better be nice to her and give her the answers she's looking for. And that's how we do it. It's amazing.
Well, before you became a state senator, you were chairman of the Georgia Republican Party.
Right.
Very historic time.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about it.
It was a marvelous time. It was probably the most fun job I have ever had in politics. While I've been fortunate to hold a lot of elective office, the thing that I've always been most fascinated by is how you put elections together. And being chairman of the Republican Party gave me an opportunity to do that. And we did some things that were really kind of historic. You're right. It was an interesting time. We're in the middle of the transition. You know, the Republican Party really kind of started in the 1950s in Georgia. You had what we call post office Republicans, which were the people that you know, ran the post office whenever there was a Republican administration, and you had African Americans, and that was pretty much it. And they were a very outcast, excluded group. But in the 1950s, you had a lot of World War II veterans coming back into Georgia who had served under General Eisenhower. And he was kind of a nonpartisan Republican, if you would. And so a lot of people in the South who'd been involved in World War II voted for General Eisenhower because he'd been the guy who won the war, and they'd served under him, and that kind of trumped politics and got some people to thinking about politics differently. And then the Goldwater campaign of '64 activated a lot of conservatives. And I was 12 years old, and I went to bed with you know, most kids listen to a transistor radio, they're listening to the baseball game. I had my transistor in my bed listening to the election returns. So, yeah, I was not your normal child. But I came back from Washington. I'd worked as assistant secretary at HUD for Secretary Kemp. And I had a group of people in the carpet industry in Dalton who knew me before I left. And they, for some reason or other, decided that I would make a good state party chairman. And so I went up to Dalton to meet with them 3 times, and they made the case. And I made the case back that, you know, I've been out of the state for 4 years. I've been in Washington. I'm starting a new business. You know, it's the last thing I need. And after the last meeting, I told them no. The 3rd meeting, I was driving back, and I'll never forget where I was. I was at the intersection of 285 and 75, and I just thought, well, you know, it'd be a good way. You probably won't win, but it'll be a really good way to get back in the state, get around the state, get networked, and meet people again since you've been out of the state for a while. Because politics is very dynamic. People come, people go. And so I called, you know, one of my very first cell phones, and I called him and said, I've changed my mind. I think I'll run. And the other candidates had been running for a couple of months, and the way we would select chairman of the Republican Party is different than any other office. I mean, you run around the state like you're a statewide candidate, but instead of talking to voters, you're talking to people who are likely to be the delegates to their local conventions, whether it's their precinct caucus, their county convention, their congressional district convention, then the state convention. There's really 4 processes. Then you become a delegate to the state convention. Those delegates elect the chairman. So you're going out explaining what you want to do. And I'd given a lot of thought. I mean, I had gone to Georgia State to get my master's in political science with a major in campaigns and elections. I thought that's what I'd do most of my life. I'd just manage campaigns. And so I'd given a lot of thought to the party structure. And in my mind, you know, in today's world, you have a lot of political consultants, and I'm one of them. I manage a lot, you know, still manage races. But if a political party is doing what it's supposed to, there's no reason for consultants and outside people. The party, in my mind, should be the largest political consulting firm in the state. And that's what I went around to the state talking about. I said, look, we can turn this thing in. We can do some interesting things. One, I'm going to take 10 young Republicans right out of college, right out of high school, wherever we get them. I'm going to train them to become campaign managers. And I'm going to put them on staff, and we're going to put them out in the state, and they're going to manage legislative races. I'm going to give them 10 races, and we're going to send, if I need to send them to Georgia State, if I need to send them to, there's all kinds of campaigns. We're going to take 10 of our best and brightest young men and women, we'll turn them into campaign managers. 1. 2, we're going to operate the party like a consulting firm. and we're going to develop. We ended up developing. I hired when I got elected, and it took 4 ballots at the state convention in Savannah to get me elected. It was a raucous. I mean, it was wonderful fun because I won, I guess. But you know, the whole process of watching a convention, how it functions. It's not like an election. I mean, there's the ebb and flow of support back and forth, and you know, you're on your walkie-talkie listening, and you say, well, the delegation in this area has got some questions, and you hustle over there to answer questions. And it literally took 4 votes, with everybody, the lowest vote getter, dropping off before I finally won on the last ballot. But I went around the state talking about my vision for how we could take the party and transform it into a political consulting firm. With consultants, we'd have a fundraising operation, and then we would, you know, we had what I call the Republican Entitlement Program. One of the big complaints that candidates always had with the party was that the party leadership, because of limited resources, they would make contributions based on who they thought could win, but it was somewhat arbitrary. And so I said, we're going to take the arbitrariness out. We're going to set up a set of criteria. There are going to be 5 things. And if you meet these 5 things, you automatically qualify for party support. And we did a lot of, we were very creative in how we did it. Before, the party was just another contributor. We would contribute the max, and so we were just another contributor to the candidates. We really didn't have much clout beyond that. So we took our contributions. There were several things that the party had that the law helped. One was we got a nonprofit postage rate, which was dramatically cheaper than the 3rd-class rate for postage. I grew up in the marketing world, so I knew about gang printing. If you print all your stuff at once, you can lower the cost of your printing. We could take existing legislators in legislative races, and we'd make them mentors of candidates. We would assign candidates, this is your mentor, and you've got to talk to your mentor. They had to document to us that they talked to their mentor at least once a week to get advice on how to campaign, to get input on issues, whatever. Then we had our consultants, and they had to talk to their consultant at least twice a week and meet with the consultant once a week, which means we had these were our in-house consultants. And they had to turn in a report saying, yes, we met with the candidates. If they did that, then they qualified for maximum funding. They got the cheaper postage rate. We did the printing for them at a much lower rate than they could get. And instead of being, you know, maybe a $2,000 contributor, we were suddenly putting, with its savings of consultants and all this other stuff, we became a $20,000 or $30,000 force in a legislative race, and maybe more than that in a Senate race. And now we had tremendous leverage and tremendous clout, and we leveraged all of our resources so that we had maximum resources going into the elections. And so we transformed how we managed campaigns. And it worked. In fact, the first 2 years, I was chairman 4 years, first 2 years, you know, we gave money to the candidates. We literally, the second round, we had candidates come to us and say, here's my budget. Will you spend it for me? Which we did. You know, we literally managed the campaigns at that level. And it was a tremendous amount of fun. Nobody had ever done it that way before, and I don't think anybody's ever really taken it to that level since. But a political party, if managed properly, can be a tremendous force. I mean, much more than most people realize in how elections are managed and structured and conducted and won. I think that we didn't get, I told everybody I didn't want to be the Moses of the Republican Party. I wanted to be the Joshua. I wanted to be the one that got us to the promised land. Well, we didn't quite get there when my term was up in 1999, so it was really the 2000 election and 2002 when we got over to the promised land. But I think what we did, the candidates we trained, the structure we put in place, a lot of the things that we did in between 95 and 99 today are still being somewhat used, though, you know, maybe not to the organized extent, but the state party, we kind of ingrained that into how they operate their campaigns. It's made a real difference, and I think helped get us over the top.
Let's talk about for a minute about some of the individuals involved in the rise of the Republican Party.
Well, you had a whole group of people. Like, one of my great mentors was Bob Shaw. Bob, and you've already done one of these with Bob. Bob was one of those guys who got involved in the 50s and then in the 60s. He was a 2-term state party chairman. When you go through life, there are people who recognize, who mentor you, who recognize maybe that you've got skills and talents in a certain area well before you recognize them yourself. And without good mentors, I don't think any of us succeed. But we had some people like Bob, who was early on a party chairman, Mac Mattingly, who ultimately became a U.S. Senator, Paul Coverdale, who was involved, Newt Gingrich down in Columbus. You had a lot of people like that who really, when you have a state that's so dominated by one party, the people who are on the opposite side are not your normal. Are not normal people. I hate to say that, and that kind of characterizes me too. Not normal from the point of view that it's much easier to get in with the tide and swim with it, with the current of the river, rather than swim upstream. The people who got involved in the Republican Party were people who were willing to swim against the tide. I mean, it was Coverdale. When I worked at the Capitol, and I was hired as a press aide for one session by Senator Coverdale. There were 5 Republican senators, and it was Paul Coverdale, Bob Bell, Jim Tysinger, George Warren, and Haskew Brantley. That was it. We had 23 members of the House, and I worked with Herb Jones, who was a minority leader in the House, and did some things for them. But all 5 of those senators had one office, one secretary, and me, all in an office not much bigger than the room we're in right now. And they were insignificant as far as being able to affect policy, and particularly in the House, where Speaker Murphy, hated Republicans and spent more. His favorite sport was humiliating them as much as he possibly could. So these were people who swam against the tide. They were not people who would, they were not normal political figures who would figure out, well, here's how the easiest way to get to power. They really were trying to transform the way politics was done in the state. And so there was a lot of time that was spent trying to figure out how to get people to pay attention. I mean, I'll never forget, when I was doing press work for the Republican Party, I'd go to the Atlanta Constitution with a press release or whatever, and I had a reporter tell me one time, say, look, you guys are not factors in Georgia politics. There's no hope you're going to be factors in Georgia politics. And if you ever get to be a factor in Georgia politics, then we'll pay attention. But in the meantime, please don't bother me with your press release. I'd been a reporter before. I know how busy they are. But, so what you end up doing is, you get a group of interesting personalities. You have people like that who really are the brain trust. And then if you went to a normal, or just an average Republican county party meeting every month, the collection of humanity it was like a freak show to some degrees, because you had all kinds. You had libertarians, you had all kinds of people who were all of them outside the mainstream. Because if you're part of the mainstream, you were over with the Democrats. So you had this collection of humanity that wanted to do politics differently for a variety of different reasons. They came for various reasons and various causes. But the people that we just named were kind of the brain trust. And you had people like Matt Patton, who was a former chairman, who was a mentor to me, Bob. I worked closely with Mattingly when he was chairman of the party. And they were trying to get a structure that would allow us to figure out how to win elections. And your candidates, I mean, we would go out to recruit candidates. I mean, ideally what you want to do when you recruit candidates, you want to go to the Chamber of Commerce, or you want to go to some, a church with, some place where they have real strong ties in the community. We'd go out, and I'll never forget, when we were recruiting a candidate, it was 1978, and the chairman of the Republican Party in DeKalb County was at the Shell station in downtown Clarkston. And we needed, Walt Russell was running, it was a House member from Clarkston, was running for commission chairman, and there was a vacant seat there. And we're trying to recruit a candidate. It wasn't a decent Republican seat at all, but you have to, take every opportunity. So he's sitting there filling up his car, and he asked the gas station attendant, said, do you know anybody here might want to run for the House? And he said, yeah, I got a customer who might want to run. She knows the neighborhood pretty well. And so Jim called her up, said, no, I don't think I'll run, but my husband might. And so sure enough, we recruited him. Roy Groves ran for the House. We got killed, absolutely slaughtered. He didn't even take his own precinct in that race. But, you know, so you would go out, recruiting was just, you know, you just throw bodies at the ballot just to have names on there and to try and, you know, field a team of people. It literally got so bad that I was going door to door in Clarkston. I was telling people my name was Roy Groves and I was running for the House. They didn't even know that I wasn't Roy Groves. And because we were just trying to use every leverage. We had no money to pay postage. So we'd figure out the routes of the postman, and we would follow him through the community just out of his sight, and we'd stuff our literature in the mail. So it looked like we mailed it. And then would, you know, to try and get our message out, just to look like a campaign. We would sit in rooms full of people. We'd have men and women folding envelopes and hand stuffing them. All this stuff is done with technology today, and we'd hand write out the envelopes. It was a, you know, and it was socially, you know, it was a wonderful time, but it was an impossible way to manage campaigns. But that's what we had to do. We had no money, no resources, no respect, no dignity, and we were just doing what we could to get a little bit of attention and maybe win. You know, we had some successes. The night Roy lost, I was also managing Tommy Talbert. Tommy was was one of the few House members that we had. And he was in a real tough election because he represents South DeKalb and it was going through some demographic changes, and we were able to pull him out one more time. But that's how we managed. And we had a group of people who were dedicated to the cause, whether you were at the top, the Brain Trust, those names that we talked about earlier, or that collection of interesting personalities who would show up and they'd have all these outlandish ideas about how things we ought to do to take control, or, you know, things we could do to get attention. And it was an amazing time politically. It was really just kind of a grassroots guerrilla movement to overthrow the government in Georgia. It was wonderful to be a young guy in the middle of all that.
Let's talk about some mileposts. 1964 had to be a milepost in Georgia.
It was. I mean, you had the first real competitive election. The Goldwater campaign mobilized and motivated a group of mostly young adults. They were people mostly my parents' age when I got to Georgia and got involved in politics. As I said, I went to bed listening, and I woke up, I was so excited because Alabama had elected about 3 or 4 members of Congress. I know Georgia had done the same thing. Ben Blackburn and Bo Calloway and people like that got elected in that era. It was fascinating, but it gave that collection of humanity that I just described hope. And hope is the most powerful thing in politics, because if you got hope, then you'll work harder and you'll think harder and you'll try and figure out what you got to do to win. So 64 gave Republicans hope, and that was followed up by some pretty decent elections in 1966. And of course, all of this was a real reaction to what was going on in the civil rights movement and Nixon's Southern strategy, and there was a whole lot of things that emerged during that period. But we were able to have some successes. We elected some people to the Georgia Senate and House. It was the first time we really had any, even though they were relatively insignificant number-wise, we did elect a few people who came in and distinguished themselves, and we had people that we could then begin to start using as role models for other candidates. They came in, they were Tommy Talbot, I mentioned earlier, people like Walt Davis, people like that were just phenomenal people who were good office holders who served as role models for others. And then we could also prove to people, yeah, you can get elected in some pretty tough districts as a Republican. So that hope that 64 generated was kind of the impetus to what really started a 30-year revolution in politics. And I don't mean to always use biblical allusions, but there was a reason Moses wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. He had a group of people that had been slaves, who come from slaves, who had been slaves for generations. He had to get a different mindset of people out to go into the promised land. Well, that's the way the Republicans were. We had to have a generation of just kind of older, Southern people who had, like my grandmother and my great-grandmother. When I was sworn in for the Senate, we were walking, my dad and I were walking across the Capitol, and we stopped at the Gene Talmadge statue, and he just looked up and said, "Your great-grandmother thought that man could walk on water." You know, those people were not going to take the Republican Party where it needed to go. We had to have a group of younger people who thought differently, who worked differently, and that hope from '64, and then we moved on in. You know, Nixon was elected in '68. He had a Southern strategy. You had old line Democrats like Strom Thurmond switching parties, and you started that whole, you could see kind of things were changing. You didn't know how long it was going to take, but we did know that from my studies at school, I knew intuitively that from the political socialization, that once you form your political identity, barring some cataclysmic event, you keep that. So you literally had to start working on the younger generation and get them to think differently, and then you just had to kind of wait till that older generation passed. So from '64 to '92, that's kind of the transition that was going on. And so we were training younger people, we were attracting younger people, and getting them ready to move into positions of leadership. And that's kind of what '64 did, and it touched off that whole process. And any political transition, literally, of that earth-shattering type, takes a long time to effect, simply because of the ingrained political attitudes that you've got to overcome. And so that's what we were able to do. We just kind of kept the pressure on. And then when we got those office holders in there, in the legislature, we started developing, we started using the parliamentary procedures to our advantage. We'd force votes that the Democrats, because of the unique nature of the coalition they had, they couldn't. We were trying to drive wedges into that Democratic coalition constantly, because you had rural white conservatives, you had urban white liberals, you had African Americans all in the same coalition, and we knew that coalition was not a natural coalition. So we were always trying to come up with things that would drive wedges in there. And so we would have, we'd set up votes on the House and the Senate that would put stress on that coalition, hoping to break it apart. And that took some time too. And then we would take those votes and use them, because a lot of these particularly in rural parts of the South, those votes that we were forcing them to take, that their leadership was forcing them on party discipline to take, were not going to be necessarily popular back home. And so then in our direct mail and all those little things we stuffed in the mailboxes, we talked about, can you believe that, he's one guy here in your town, and when he gets up to Atlanta, he votes this way. And it takes a while, because they know these people. They don't quite believe it, but over time, it begins to seep in that, hey, there's something not right here. So it took us a while to drive the wedges into that coalition that finally broke in 1992, which allowed us to start really making gains. And then really, with the redistricting of 2001 and the election of 2002, kind of allowed us to break everything apart and take over.